The strongest moments in life rarely look important while they're happening. They arrive as ordinary conversations, careless remarks, unexpected criticism, or disappointments so small they seem forgettable. Then, almost without noticing, a few seconds reshape something much larger. A relationship changes, a reputation shifts, a memory settles in more deeply than it should. Looking back, it seldom feels as though one dramatic decision changed everything. More often, it was a brief moment when emotion spoke before wisdom had the chance. Life moves at a pace that rewards immediate reactions. Messages expect instant replies. Opinions seem to demand instant defense. Emotions insist they should be expressed the moment they appear, as though speed were a sign of honesty. But the faster we react, the less room we leave for judgment, perspective, and clarity. Long before psychology described emotional impulses or neuroscience explained the brain's response to stress, Stoic thinkers kept returning to the same quiet observation. Lasting disturbance rarely begins with the event itself. It begins with the meaning the mind assigns to that event before it has fully understood what happened. The most important part of that process is almost impossible to see. It exists in the narrow space between what happens and how you respond. Measured in seconds, that space often determines whether frustration hardens into regret or softens into understanding, whether conflict grows or quietly dissolves. Learning to protect it is not simply an exercise in emotional control. It is the beginning of self-mastery. And once that habit takes root, the world gradually loses its ability to dictate the state of your inner life. A harsh comment can leave someone's mouth and disappear within seconds, yet the reaction it awakens inside you can continue unfolding long after the conversation has ended. Hours later, the words are still being replayed, but something else has quietly joined them. The mind begins filling empty spaces with assumptions. Maybe they were trying to humiliate you. Maybe they never respected you in the first place. Maybe everyone else secretly agrees with them. None of these conclusions arrive fully formed. They appear one after another, each one convincing enough to feel like reality. By the time you notice what is happening, the original event has already been buried beneath layers of interpretation. What began as a single moment has become an entire story. And the story now feels far more painful than the event itself. This is how emotional reactions often begin. They rarely announce themselves with dramatic intensity. More often, they arrive quietly, almost invisibly. Your breathing changes before you notice it. Your shoulders become tense without permission. Your thoughts start moving faster than usual, searching for explanations, preparing arguments, defending your pride before anyone has even attacked it. The body reacts first, then the mind rushes to justify those sensations. It feels automatic because in many ways, it is. Human beings evolved to detect danger quickly, and for much of history, that ability was essential for survival. The challenge is that the same ancient system now responds to uncomfortable conversations, criticism, rejection, and uncertainty, with nearly the same urgency it once reserved for physical threats. Your nervous system cannot always distinguish between a wounded ego and genuine danger. It simply prepares you to fight, escape, or defend yourself. That explains why reactions often feel impossible to stop once they begin. By the time conscious thought enters the picture, the emotional machinery has already started moving. You are no longer responding only to what happened. You are responding to the physical sensations, the memories they awaken, and the predictions your mind immediately creates about what comes next. A delayed message suddenly becomes evidence that something is wrong. A brief look from another person becomes proof they dislike you. A disagreement quietly transforms into a threat against your identity. None of these interpretations are guaranteed to be true, but the emotional brain values certainty more than accuracy. It would rather invent a convincing explanation than tolerate uncertainty for very long. This is where awareness quietly changes everything. not because awareness instantly removes uncomfortable emotions, but because it interrupts the illusion that they are telling the complete truth. The first time you notice your own mind creating these stories, something remarkable happens. You realize there are two experiences unfolding at the same time. One is the situation itself. The other is the interpretation your mind is constructing around it. Until that distinction becomes visible, the two feel identical. You believe you are reacting to reality when, in many cases, you are reacting to your interpretation of reality. That single realization creates space where previously there was only impulse. The Stoic philosophers placed enormous importance on this space because they understood something that modern psychology continues to confirm. As Marcus Aurelius reminded himself, you have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. Human suffering is often intensified not by external events themselves, but by the judgments attached to those events. That does not mean painful experiences are imaginary or that difficult emotions should be ignored. It means the first version of reality presented by the emotional mind is not always the most reliable one. Learning to pause before accepting every thought as fact becomes one of the greatest forms of self-protection. Instead of asking whether your feelings are valid, you begin asking whether the story attached to those feelings is complete. That question alone changes the direction of your inner life. Instead of immediately defending yourself, proving yourself, or preparing for conflict, you become curious. Curiosity has a calming effect because it replaces certainty with observation. You begin noticing details that previously escaped your attention. Perhaps the other person's words reflected their own frustration rather than your worth. Perhaps their tone had more to do with their circumstances than with your character. Perhaps nothing truly important happened at all except inside your own imagination. These possibilities were always available, but emotional urgency prevented you from seeing them. Gradually, you discover that awareness is not passive. It is an active discipline requiring patience every single day. The mind does not stop creating stories simply because you recognize the pattern once. It continues doing what it has always done. The difference is that you begin catching it earlier. You notice the tightening in your chest before your thoughts spiral completely out of control. You recognize familiar emotional habits before they become familiar emotional decisions. The distance between stimulus and reaction slowly widens, and within that widening space, something stronger than impulse begins taking shape. This process does not make life free from emotion. Disappointment still arrives, frustration still appears, fear still visits from time to time. The goal was never to eliminate these experiences because they are part of being human. The real transformation lies elsewhere. Instead of becoming carried away by every emotional current, you learn to remain present while the feeling moves through you. You stop treating emotions like commands that demand immediate obedience. They become information instead of instructions. They tell you something deserves attention, but they no longer decide what your next action must be. Over time, this quiet practice reshapes the way you move through ordinary life. Situations that once consumed your entire day lose much of their influence because they no longer receive immediate permission to define your reality. A careless remark becomes exactly that, a careless remark. An unexpected setback becomes something to understand rather than something to personalize. The mind still notices these moments, but it no longer builds endless narratives around them. Awareness quietly dissolves many battles before they ever begin, and in doing so, it reveals a form of strength that has nothing to do with controlling other people. It comes from learning to observe yourself clearly enough that your own reactions stop becoming the greatest obstacle to your peace. Once you begin recognizing that your reactions are happening in real time instead of only after the damage is done, a quieter and more uncomfortable realization begins to appear. The emotion itself is only part of the experience. Beneath it sits something older, something that has been quietly shaping your responses for years without asking for permission. A careless comment from one person barely registers, while a similar remark from someone else lingers for days. One setback becomes a passing inconvenience, while another seems to shake your confidence entirely. The situations may look similar on the surface, yet they leave completely different marks because they are touching different places within you. The event is only the spark. The deeper response comes from what was already waiting beneath it. This is why two people can walk through the same experience and carry away completely different memories. One hears criticism and sees an opportunity to improve. Another hears the exact same words and feels rejected. One faces uncertainty with curiosity, while another immediately expects failure. Neither person is intentionally choosing these reactions in the moment. They are responding through patterns that have been forming quietly over many years. Those patterns become so familiar that they stop feeling like interpretations and begin feeling like reality itself. The mind rarely announces that it is filtering experience through old beliefs. It simply presents its conclusions with remarkable confidence, encouraging you to believe that the world truly is exactly as you perceive it. Many of these beliefs were never consciously chosen. They developed through repeated experiences, early disappointments, private victories, relationships that built trust, and relationships that quietly eroded it. A child who constantly feels overlooked may become an adult who notices exclusion everywhere. Someone who was repeatedly criticized may begin hearing judgment even inside neutral conversations. Another person who learned that mistakes were acceptable may approach the same situations with far less emotional resistance. None of this happens because one individual is stronger than another. It happens because the mind constantly compares the present to the emotional blueprint it has been carrying for years. Without realizing it, yesterday keeps explaining today. This hidden process becomes especially powerful because the brain prefers familiarity over accuracy. Familiar emotional patterns require very little effort. If your mind has spent years expecting disappointment, it becomes remarkably efficient at finding evidence that confirms those expectations. It notices the unanswered message while overlooking the thoughtful conversation that came before it. It remembers one criticism while forgetting 10 sincere compliments. It pays extraordinary attention to signs of danger because it believes preparing for pain is safer than remaining open to uncertainty. The result is a life that feels increasingly predictable, not because reality has become predictable, but because your expectations quietly shape what receives your attention. Psychologists often describe this as confirmation bias, but the experience feels much more personal than the term suggests. It feels like instinct, it feels like intuition, it feels like common sense. That is exactly why it becomes so difficult to challenge. When an old belief whispers that you are being ignored, disrespected, or underestimated, your emotional response arrives before your logical mind has time to investigate whether the conclusion is actually true. The feeling seems to prove the belief, and the belief strengthens the feeling. Together, they create a cycle that becomes harder to recognize with each repetition. Breaking that cycle begins with a willingness to become curious about your own emotional patterns instead of immediately defending them. Curiosity changes the relationship you have with your reactions because it replaces certainty with observation. Instead of saying, "This situation made me feel this way," you begin asking yourself why this particular situation reached you so deeply while another one passed almost unnoticed. The question is not meant to criticize your emotions or convince you that they are invalid. It is meant to uncover the deeper expectations quietly shaping your experience. The answer is rarely found in the present moment alone. More often, it points towards something your mind has been carrying for much longer than you realized. This kind of reflection requires patience because hidden beliefs rarely reveal themselves all at once. They appear gradually through repeated observation. You notice that similar situations continue producing similar emotions. You recognize that certain words consistently trigger defensiveness, while certain forms of uncertainty immediately create anxiety. Patterns begin emerging where previously there only seemed to be isolated incidents. The more honestly you observe these patterns, the less mysterious your reactions become. Instead of seeing yourself as unpredictable or overly emotional, you begin understanding the quiet logic behind your inner world. Understanding does not remove the feeling immediately, but it prevents you from becoming completely controlled by it. If these reflections are helping you see yourself and your own mind a little more clearly, consider subscribing. It's a commitment to returning again and again to ideas that strengthen your character, steady your mind, and remind you that wisdom is built through quiet practice, one day at a time. Now, let's continue. That is one of the most practical lessons found within Stoic thinking. Lasting freedom is not created by controlling every event around you. It grows through understanding the judgments you continuously bring into those events. The external world will always present uncertainty, disagreement, disappointment, and unexpected change. Those realities cannot be negotiated away. What slowly changes is the lens through which you experience them. As hidden fears lose their influence and unconscious expectations become visible, situations that once felt overwhelming begin losing much of their emotional weight. The world has not become gentler. Your understanding of yourself has become clearer, and that clarity quietly becomes the beginning of lasting inner stability. Once you begin recognizing that your emotional reactions are not random, another realization quietly begins taking shape. Certain moments seem to carry a weight far greater than they should. A stranger's opinion is forgotten within minutes, while one sentence from someone close to you echoes in your mind for days. A small mistake at work feels impossible to let go of, yet a much larger setback barely disturbs someone standing beside you. The event itself cannot fully explain the difference. Something deeper is deciding how much emotional significance each experience receives before you consciously evaluate it. That deeper influence is often invisible because it has become so familiar that it feels like part of your personality. In reality, it is often a collection of beliefs, expectations, and emotional memories that have quietly accumulated over years, shaping how you interpret the present without ever announcing their presence. The mind is constantly trying to answer one question before you even realize it has been asked. What does this mean? A delayed reply is no longer just a delayed reply. It becomes evidence that someone is losing interest. Constructive criticism is no longer simply advice. It becomes proof that you are inadequate. Someone declining an invitation quietly transforms into rejection. The remarkable part is not that these conclusions appear, it is how quickly they appear. Your brain dislikes uncertainty because uncertainty demands patience, and patience requires energy. Creating an immediate explanation feels safer than remaining in doubt. Even when that explanation is inaccurate, it provides a temporary sense of certainty. The emotional mind often prefers a painful answer over no answer at all, because uncertainty feels like unfinished business that demands constant attention. This habit develops so gradually that very few people notice it happening. Throughout childhood, adolescence, and adulthood, experiences begin leaving impressions that eventually become expectations. If trust is repeatedly broken, the mind learns to anticipate disappointment before evidence even appears. If praise is rare but criticism is frequent, success begins feeling temporary while mistakes become permanent in your memory. If acceptance often depended on pleasing others, disagreement can start feeling dangerous instead of normal. None of these patterns are conscious decisions, they are adaptations. At one point, they may have helped you navigate difficult environments or relationships. The problem begins when those old adaptations continue operating long after the circumstances that created them have disappeared. That is why identical situations rarely produce identical emotional experiences. Picture two people walking into the same meeting. Both receive exactly the same feedback. One leaves feeling motivated, already thinking about how to improve. The other spends the evening replaying every sentence, convinced they have failed. The feedback did not create those two realities. It simply collided with two completely different internal worlds. One person's identity remained separate from the criticism. The other's identity fused with it immediately. The difference was never intelligence, strength, or resilience alone. It was the quiet collection of assumptions already waiting beneath the surface before the conversation even began. Modern psychology often speaks about cognitive filters, mental frameworks that influence perception without requiring conscious effort. The Stoics arrived at a similar observation through careful reflection rather than scientific research. They noticed that human beings rarely suffer from events in isolation. They suffer from the judgments attached to those events. That insight remains just as relevant today because the human mind still works in remarkably familiar ways. Long before an emotion reaches full intensity, it has already passed through countless invisible filters, asking whether this situation confirms an old fear, protects an old belief, or threatens an important part of your identity. By the time you consciously experience the feeling, much of that evaluation has already happened beneath awareness. This is why emotional growth requires more than learning how to stay calm in difficult moments. Calmness without understanding often becomes suppression, and suppressed emotions rarely disappear. They simply wait for another opportunity to emerge. Real understanding asks different questions. Instead of focusing only on what happened, you begin exploring why it affected you in such a specific way. That shift is subtle, but it changes everything. Rather than treating your emotional reaction as the final answer, you begin treating it as valuable information. Every intense reaction becomes an invitation to understand yourself more clearly. Instead of immediately defending the feeling or criticizing yourself for having it, you quietly observe where it leads. As this practice becomes familiar, patterns slowly begin revealing themselves. You notice that uncertainty consistently creates tension. Comparison quietly drains your confidence. Feeling misunderstood activates an unusually strong emotional response. Being ignored affects you more deeply than being criticized. These discoveries are not weaknesses, they are maps. Each one points towards something your mind has been trying to protect for years. Once those patterns become visible, they lose some of their power because they are no longer operating entirely in the shadows. Awareness does not erase them overnight, but it prevents them from controlling every situation without your knowledge. An unexpected sense of compassion often grows alongside this understanding. Looking honestly at your own emotional patterns makes it easier to recognize that everyone else is carrying invisible patterns too. The impatient coworker may not simply be impatient. The defensive friend may not simply enjoy arguments. The person who constantly seeks approval may be carrying fears no one else can see. This perspective does not excuse harmful behavior or remove the need for healthy boundaries. It simply reminds you that visible actions often have invisible roots. Responding from that awareness creates far more clarity than reacting to appearances alone. Gradually, the emotional world becomes less confusing. Situations that once felt intensely personal begin revealing their deeper structure. You realize that life is not constantly attacking your peace. More often, old expectations are quietly negotiating with new experiences, trying to predict the future using memories from the past. Once you see that process unfolding, you stop believing every emotional conclusion the instant it appears. You become slower to judge, slower to assume, and much quicker to observe. That patience creates a freedom impossible to discover while living entirely through automatic reactions, because understanding your hidden beliefs is not about changing who you are. It is about seeing clearly enough to decide who you want to become. As those hidden patterns begin revealing themselves, another truth slowly comes into focus. It is not only your thoughts that shape your emotional life, it is also the invisible struggle to control things that were never yours to control in the first place. This struggle is so common that it often feels normal. You want people to understand your intentions, appreciate your efforts, agree with your choices, and respond the way you believe they should. None of those desires seem unreasonable on their own. The difficulty begins when your emotional balance quietly becomes dependent on whether those expectations are fulfilled. Without realizing it, your peace starts living in other people's decisions instead of your own mind. The result is exhausting because no matter how carefully you plan your words or actions, another person's thoughts remain forever beyond your reach. This realization can feel uncomfortable because it challenges one of the mind's favorite illusions. It whispers that if only certain people behaved differently, everything would become easier. If they apologized, respected you more, supported your choices, answered your messages sooner, or finally recognized your value, then peace would naturally follow. At first, this sounds convincing because it places the source of discomfort somewhere outside yourself. It offers hope that emotional stability will arrive as soon as the world cooperates. But the longer you live this way, the more fragile your inner life becomes. Every conversation carries unnecessary pressure. Every disagreement feels larger than it really is. Every unexpected response has the potential to disturb an entire day because your emotional foundation has quietly been built upon conditions you cannot enforce. This dependence often develops so gradually that it escapes notice. You begin checking for approval without calling it approval. You replay conversations hoping to discover whether someone secretly judged you. You adjust your decisions to avoid disappointing people whose opinions continue occupying far more space in your mind than they deserve. Little by little, attention shifts away from your own principles and toward managing everyone else's reactions. It feels responsible, even considerate, yet underneath that effort sits a constant tension. The mind remains busy calculating possibilities that cannot be controlled, trying to predict moods, prevent misunderstandings, and secure reassurance before uncertainty has the chance to grow. The more energy invested in this impossible task, the less remains available for the one place where meaningful influence actually exists. The Stoics returned to this distinction again and again because they recognized how easily human beings confuse influence with ownership. You can influence another person's opinion, but you cannot own it. You can speak honestly, but you cannot command understanding. You can offer kindness without receiving kindness in return. You can prepare carefully and still encounter failure. None of these realities are pleasant, yet resisting them creates a second layer of suffering far heavier than the first. The original disappointment may last only a moment. The refusal to accept its limits can continue for weeks, months, or even years. Instead of carrying one burden, you begin carrying two: the event itself and the endless frustration that reality refused to obey your expectations. Notice how often emotional pain grows after the event has already ended. Someone responds coldly and the conversation is over. Yet the mind continues negotiating with something that no longer exists. It invents better responses, imagines different outcomes, and searches endlessly for a version of reality where everyone behaves exactly as desired. Hours pass while nothing in the external world changes, yet internally, the struggle continues without rest. This is where much emotional exhaustion is created, not by life itself, but by repeatedly attempting to rewrite experiences that have already become part of the past, or trying to manage people whose choices belong entirely to them. Recognizing this pattern is not an invitation to become indifferent. It does not mean other people's actions suddenly stop mattering or that relationships lose their importance. Quite the opposite. Healthy relationships become stronger when they are no longer built upon constant attempts to control one another. Respect cannot be forced. Trust cannot be demanded. Understanding cannot be extracted through endless explanation. These qualities grow naturally when both people remain free to choose them. The moment they become requirements for your emotional stability, they quietly lose the very qualities that made them valuable in the first place. This shift changes the questions you begin asking yourself. Instead of wondering how to make someone see things your way, your attention turns towards something far more productive. Did you act according to your values? Did you speak honestly? Did you remain respectful even when emotions invited you elsewhere? These questions return responsibility to the only place it has ever truly belonged. They do not guarantee comfort or immediate success, but they provide something much more reliable than external approval. They create consistency. When your self-respect depends primarily on your own conduct rather than another person's response, emotional stability stops rising and falling with every passing interaction. At first, living this way feels unfamiliar because the habit of reaching outward has been practiced for so long. The mind still wants reassurance. It still hopes everyone will understand, agree, and appreciate what you intended. Those desires do not disappear overnight. What changes is your relationship with them. You begin noticing when they appear instead of automatically obeying them. A disappointing response still stings, but it no longer defines the entire experience. Criticism still captures your attention, yet it is examined instead of immediately accepted as truth. Praise becomes enjoyable without becoming necessary. Rejection becomes painful without becoming your identity. Emotional balance slowly moves away from circumstances that cannot be controlled and settles within choices that remain available regardless of what the world decides to do. Over time, an unexpected sense of freedom begins emerging from this practice. You spend less energy chasing certainty where none exists and more energy strengthening qualities that no one can take from you. Patience becomes easier because it no longer depends on immediate results. Integrity becomes steadier because it is measured by your actions rather than someone else's opinion. Even disappointment changes its character. Instead of feeling like proof that something is wrong with you, it becomes another reminder that life has always contained uncertainty, disagreement, and outcomes beyond your command. Accepting that reality does not make you passive. It makes you present. And once your attention returns fully to what actually belongs to you, peace stops feeling like something that must be earned from the world and begins growing from the quiet discipline of governing your own mind. Once you begin separating what belongs to you from what never did, something subtle starts changing inside you. The world itself remains exactly as unpredictable as it has always been. People still disagree, plans still fall apart. Unexpected problems continue appearing without invitation. The difference is no longer found in the events themselves. It is found in the amount of authority you quietly hand over to them. What once felt like a direct attack on your peace slowly becomes another passing circumstance moving through your day. That change is almost invisible at first. You may not even notice it happening. One afternoon you realize a comment that would have bothered you for hours barely stayed in your mind for a few minutes. Another day you recognize that someone else's bad mood no longer determines your own. The situations have not become gentler. You have simply stopped allowing every external event to decide what happens inside you. This quiet shift often surprises people because they expect emotional growth to feel dramatic. They imagine waking up one morning completely unaffected by criticism, disappointment, or uncertainty. Real change rarely works that way. It happens in ordinary moments that almost seem too small to matter. Someone interrupts you, and instead of feeling personally disrespected, you simply continue speaking when the opportunity returns. A stranger behaves rudely, and your attention stays focused on your own conduct instead of trying to understand why they acted that way. Plans change unexpectedly, and rather than spending the next several hours arguing with reality, you begin adjusting to what is actually happening. These moments may appear insignificant from the outside, yet they quietly reshape your entire emotional landscape because they prove something important. Peace does not require perfect circumstances. It requires a different relationship with imperfect ones. Much of this transformation comes from recognizing how often the ego quietly inserts itself into situations where it does not belong. Someone disagrees with your opinion, and the ego whispers that your value is now being questioned. Someone forgets to acknowledge your effort, and the ego insists you have been overlooked. A simple misunderstanding becomes evidence that people do not appreciate you enough. The ego has a remarkable ability to personalize events that were never truly personal. It constantly asks how everything reflects upon you, measuring conversations, successes, setbacks, and even other people's moods according to what they appear to say about your identity. Living this way creates endless emotional labor because the mind never stops searching for hidden meanings behind ordinary experiences. There is also an unexpected confidence that grows from this practice. It is quieter than the confidence built upon praise because it does not disappear when praise disappears. It is steadier than confidence built upon success because setbacks cannot easily destroy it. As Epictetus observed, men are disturbed not by things, but by the views they take of them. This confidence comes from repeatedly observing yourself remain composed in situations where your old habits once took control. Each time you respond with greater patience instead of immediate reaction, you collect another piece of evidence that your emotional life is becoming less dependent on external conditions. Self-trust grows naturally from these experiences because you begin seeing yourself as someone capable of remaining grounded even when circumstances become unpredictable. Over time, this steadiness influences far more than isolated moments of emotional control. It changes the atmosphere you carry into everyday life. Conversations become lighter because you are no longer searching for hidden insults inside every sentence. Relationships become healthier because you stop expecting others to constantly reassure your worth. Decisions become clearer because fear of judgment no longer speaks louder than your own values. Even periods of uncertainty become more manageable because your attention remains focused on the next wise action instead of endless speculation about outcomes beyond your influence. Life still contains complexity, but much of the unnecessary noise begins fading into the background. Learning to experience emotions without becoming controlled by them requires a different kind of courage. Instead of escaping discomfort, you remain present with it long enough to understand what it is trying to reveal. Anger may point toward a boundary that has been crossed. Fear may highlight uncertainty that deserves careful preparation rather than immediate panic. Sadness may remind you that something meaningful has been lost. None of these emotions are enemies. They become destructive only when they are either blindly obeyed or completely denied. Between those two extremes lies another possibility. You can recognize an emotion, allow it to exist, and still choose your response according to your values rather than your impulses. That space between feeling and action is where lasting strength quietly develops. As this practice becomes more familiar, your relationship with yourself begins changing in subtle but meaningful ways. Instead of fearing uncomfortable emotions, you become curious about them. Instead of judging yourself for experiencing them, you recognize them as natural parts of being human. That acceptance creates surprising freedom because the energy once spent resisting your inner world becomes available for understanding it. You no longer need every difficult feeling to disappear before you can move forward. You simply stop allowing temporary emotional weather to determine the direction of your entire life. Calmness is no longer something you perform for others to see. It becomes the quiet confidence that every feeling can be experienced without becoming the architect of your character. And that realization allows you to meet both yourself and the world with greater honesty, patience, and enduring peace. This is where patience quietly transforms from passive waiting into active awareness. Waiting is often misunderstood as doing nothing, but genuine patience requires remarkable discipline. It asks you to resist the temptation to reach immediate conclusions before enough understanding exists. Think about how often the first explanation your mind offers later turns out to be incomplete. Someone seems distant, and you assume they are upset with you. Hours later, you discover they were overwhelmed by something entirely unrelated. An opportunity disappears, and you convince yourself you have failed, only to realize months later that losing it opened a path you never would have considered otherwise. Life repeatedly demonstrates that first impressions are not always final truths. Patience simply gives reality enough time to reveal itself before your assumptions take permanent control. That perspective changes the emotional experience itself. Instead of reacting to frustration with more frustration, you begin noticing what the frustration is protecting. Sometimes it is protecting unrealistic expectations. Sometimes it is protecting an image of yourself that feels threatened. Sometimes it is revealing exhaustion, loneliness, or disappointment that has been quietly accumulating beneath the surface. Strong emotions often disguise quieter ones. Anger may be covering hurt. Irritation may be hiding fear. Constant busyness may be protecting you from stillness, because stillness leaves no place to hide from your own thoughts. When patience enters the picture, these deeper layers slowly become visible. You realize that emotions are rarely isolated experiences. They are connected to beliefs, memories, and unmet needs that deserve understanding rather than immediate judgment. This growing steadiness also changes your relationship with yourself. You become less interested in criticizing every emotional reaction and more interested in understanding it honestly. Self-judgment gradually gives way to self-awareness. Rather than asking why you cannot simply be calmer, stronger, or more disciplined, you begin appreciating that emotional growth rarely happens through force. It happens through repeated observation, gentle correction, and the willingness to keep learning from your own experience. Progress becomes less about never feeling difficult emotions and more about recognizing them sooner, understanding them more clearly, and responding to them with greater wisdom than you did before. This realization does not happen because you become more naive or because you suddenly excuse poor behavior. It happens because you become more observant. Instead of stopping your attention at another person's words, you begin noticing the emotional atmosphere surrounding those words. Someone who speaks harshly may have spent the entire morning carrying stress that has nothing to do with the conversation taking place. Someone who seems distant may be fighting worries they have never shared with anyone. Another person may appear defensive not because your opinion threatens them, but because criticism has always felt dangerous in their life. None of these possibilities can be confirmed immediately, but allowing room for them changes the way you respond. Instead of rushing to defend yourself against every uncomfortable interaction, you create enough space for understanding to exist before judgment takes over. The mind naturally resists this way of thinking because personalizing situations feels easier than accepting complexity. If someone treats you unfairly, the emotional brain immediately searches for an explanation that places you at the center of the story. Perhaps you said something wrong. Perhaps they dislike you. Perhaps you failed in some invisible way. These conclusions provide quick answers, even when they are inaccurate. Accepting that another person's behavior may have little to do with you requires patience because it leaves uncertainty unresolved for a while. Yet uncertainty is often far closer to the truth than the immediate stories your emotions create. Human beings are wonderfully complicated. Every conversation is shaped by countless invisible experiences that neither person fully understands in the moment. Modern psychology often reminds us that people interpret reality through their own emotional history rather than through objective observation alone. Someone who has repeatedly experienced betrayal may become suspicious where trust actually exists. Someone accustomed to criticism may hear judgment inside neutral feedback. Another person who fears rejection may withdraw before genuine connection even has the opportunity to develop. These patterns rarely appear intentionally. They become automatic over years of repeated experience until they begin feeling like ordinary reality. Recognizing this in yourself already creates greater emotional freedom. Recognizing it in others creates something equally valuable. Compassion begins replacing constant defensiveness because you stop assuming every difficult interaction is a deliberate attack directed specifically toward you. This quieter way of seeing people also protects your own peace in ways that become increasingly noticeable over time. Emotional storms continue appearing around you because they are part of life. Someone loses patience. Another person becomes unfair. Unexpected conflict interrupts an otherwise peaceful day. Earlier, these moments may have pulled you directly into the same emotional current. Now they begin passing differently. You observe them without immediately becoming part of them. Another person's anger no longer requires your anger. Their anxiety no longer becomes your anxiety. Their disappointment no longer defines your entire emotional landscape. The storm is still visible, but you no longer mistake witnessing it for needing to enter it. Perhaps that is one of the deepest forms of strength a person can develop. Not the ability to avoid difficult people or eliminate conflict from life, because neither goal is realistic. Real strength grows from learning that someone else's emotional state does not have to become your own. Their struggles deserve understanding, their actions deserve appropriate responses, and their humanity deserves respect, but none of those realities require you to surrender your own inner balance. Once that distinction becomes part of the way you move through the world, relationships become healthier, compassion becomes wiser, and peace no longer depends on everyone around you behaving exactly as you hoped they would. It begins resting somewhere much quieter, somewhere no passing emotional storm can easily reach. As your understanding of other people becomes quieter and more balanced, something equally important begins happening within you. The standards you use to evaluate yourself slowly begin changing as well. Earlier, your confidence may have risen and fallen depending on how people responded to you. Praise felt like proof that you were doing well. Criticism felt like evidence that something was wrong. Approval created temporary security, while rejection quietly unsettled your entire sense of identity. It is an exhausting way to live because your self-worth becomes tied to conditions that change constantly. One encouraging conversation lifts your mood. One disappointing interaction pulls it back down. Without realizing it, your emotional life begins revolving around opinions that were never fully yours to control. As this pattern becomes visible, a different possibility gradually appears. You begin wondering whether your value has been measured by the wrong things all along. This question is uncomfortable because it challenges habits that often develop over many years. From an early age, people are rewarded for pleasing others, meeting expectations, avoiding mistakes, and earning approval. There is nothing inherently wrong with appreciation or recognition. They can encourage growth and strengthen relationships. The difficulty begins when they quietly become the foundation of your identity. If feeling valuable depends entirely on being admired, understood, or accepted, then your confidence will always remain vulnerable. Every disagreement starts feeling dangerous because it threatens something much deeper than the conversation itself. Every criticism becomes more than feedback. It begins sounding like a judgment on who you are. Gradually, the pursuit of external validation stops feeling like a choice and starts feeling like a necessity. That does not mean criticism suddenly loses all emotional impact. Honest feedback can still be uncomfortable. Rejection can still disappoint. Being misunderstood can still hurt. Emotional maturity does not erase these experiences because they are natural parts of being human. The difference lies in how deeply they reach. Earlier, criticism might have shaken your entire identity because your worth depended upon avoiding it. Now it becomes something you examine rather than automatically believe. If the criticism contains truth, you learn from it without condemning yourself. If it is unfair, You allow it to remain someone else's opinion instead of transforming it into your own self-image. This balanced approach creates remarkable emotional stability because you stop treating every external judgment as though it carries equal authority over your life. Over time, you also notice that your decisions become simpler. Earlier, many choices were influenced by how they might appear to other people. You hesitated before speaking honestly because disagreement felt threatening. You postponed important decisions because disappointing someone seemed unbearable. You compared your progress constantly because your identity depended on measuring yourself against everyone else. As your inner foundation grows stronger, these habits gradually lose their influence. You still consider other people's perspectives because wisdom values understanding. The difference is that those perspectives no longer replace your own judgment. They become information rather than instructions. You listen carefully without surrendering your ability to think independently. This growing independence creates a surprising sense of peace. You spend less energy performing versions of yourself designed to satisfy different audiences. Conversations become more genuine because you are no longer constantly calculating how every word will be received. Relationships become healthier because they are built upon honesty instead of endless approval seeking. Even solitude begins feeling different. Earlier, being alone may have encouraged self-doubt because external reassurance was temporarily unavailable. Now those quiet moments become opportunities to reconnect with your own thoughts without immediately questioning your worth. The relationship you build with yourself slowly becomes steadier than the changing opinions surrounding you. People often mistake this kind of stability for emotional detachment, but the opposite is true. You become more present because your attention is no longer consumed by protecting your image. Instead of constantly monitoring how you appear, you become genuinely interested in understanding, listening, and responding thoughtfully. Your confidence stops demanding attention because it no longer depends upon being noticed. It quietly supports your actions from beneath the surface, allowing you to remain composed whether circumstances bring praise or criticism. Others often sense this difference before you fully recognize it yourself. They notice someone who no longer seems desperate to impress or fearful of disagreement. Calmness gradually replaces defensiveness because your identity has become less fragile. This shift becomes especially noticeable in everyday situations that once consumed enormous emotional energy. Someone does not respond to your message as quickly as expected. Rather than constructing elaborate explanations, you allow space for countless possibilities that have nothing to do with you. An opportunity remains undecided. Instead of imagining every possible failure, you continue focusing on the responsibilities already within your reach. A difficult conversation ends without complete resolution. Rather than forcing immediate closure, you allow both yourself and the other person time to think. These moments appear ordinary from the outside, yet together they transform the quality of your inner life because they prevent unnecessary suffering from taking root before reality has had the chance to unfold. The Stoics understood that human beings often suffer twice. They experience the challenge itself, and then they experience the countless imagined versions of that challenge created by an anxious mind searching desperately for certainty. Much of this second suffering exists only because the future remains unwritten. The imagination begins filling empty spaces with worst-case scenarios, rehearsing conversations that never happen, preparing for disappointments that never arrive, and carrying emotional burdens that belong to events that exist only in possibility. Recognizing this habit does not instantly quiet the imagination, but it changes how seriously you take its predictions. Thoughts about the future stop being treated as reliable forecasts. They become possibilities rather than promises. That distinction quietly restores enormous amounts of emotional energy. As this perspective deepens, another unexpected benefit begins appearing. You become less afraid of making imperfect decisions. Earlier, every choice carried enormous pressure because you believed there was only one correct outcome, and that making the wrong decision would permanently define your future. Now you begin recognizing that life has always involved uncertainty, regardless of how carefully you prepare. Even wise decisions sometimes produce disappointing outcomes. Even difficult experiences can eventually lead toward unexpected opportunities. This understanding removes some of the impossible burden you once placed upon yourself. Instead of demanding perfect certainty before acting, you focus on making the best decision possible with the information currently available. That approach creates confidence rooted in judgment rather than prediction. You also notice that uncertainty becomes easier to carry because your attention gradually shifts away from outcomes and toward daily conduct. Instead of measuring your peace by whether life unfolds according to your plans, you begin measuring it by whether you continue acting with patience, honesty, and clarity, regardless of changing circumstances. This subtle change has profound consequences. Success becomes satisfying without becoming necessary for emotional stability. Temporary setbacks become disappointing without convincing you that your future has been destroyed. Even periods of waiting lose much of their emotional weight because they are no longer interpreted as empty spaces that must immediately be filled with answers. They become part of the natural rhythm through which understanding develops. With enough practice, uncertainty begins losing its reputation as something dangerous. It remains uncomfortable from time to time, but discomfort no longer automatically becomes distress. You stop demanding that life explain itself before allowing yourself to experience peace. You stop believing that calmness must wait until every question has been answered, every relationship has become predictable, or every future outcome has been guaranteed. Instead, you begin discovering that peace has always been available within the present moment, quietly waiting beneath the constant search for certainty. The future remains unknown, just as it always has. The difference is that you no longer see that unknown as a threat standing between you and a meaningful life. You see it as the open space where growth, resilience, and wisdom continue unfolding, one patient step at a time. With greater resilience comes another realization that many people overlook for years. The heaviest weight you carry is often not the challenge in front of you, but the emotional habits you continue carrying long after the challenge has passed. An argument ends, yet you replay it for days. A disappointment belongs to last year, yet it still influences today's decisions. A mistake has already taught its lesson, but your mind insists on revisiting it as though another review will somehow produce a different outcome. These patterns become so familiar that they stop feeling like choices. They simply become part of the background noise of everyday life. Without noticing it, you begin waking up each morning carrying emotional luggage that no longer serves any purpose. The strange part is that much of this burden is not created by the present moment at all. It is created by the habit of continuously returning to moments that no longer exist. The mind often believes that holding on is a form of protection. It convinces you that replaying painful memories will prevent future mistakes. It argues that worrying today will somehow prepare you for tomorrow. It whispers that rehearsing conversations in advance will protect you from embarrassment or rejection. These habits appear reasonable because they disguise themselves as responsibility. In reality, they rarely produce the clarity they promise. Endless mental rehearsals do not create certainty. They simply create exhaustion. Repeated worry does not increase control. It often steals your attention from the only moment where meaningful action is possible. The emotional brain struggles to distinguish between solving a problem and repeatedly thinking about a problem. To it, both activities feel productive, even when one quietly drains your energy without moving your life forward. This attachment to old experiences is rarely intentional. It develops through repetition. The more often you revisit a particular memory, the more familiar the emotional pathway becomes. Eventually, your mind returns there almost automatically whenever something similar happens. One criticism awakens memories of previous criticism. One disappointment reminds you of countless others. Before long, you are no longer responding only to today's situation. You are responding to years of accumulated emotional history arriving all at once. That is why certain reactions can feel much larger than the event itself. The present has quietly merged with the past until separating them becomes difficult. What appears to be one emotional response is often many old responses speaking together. The Stoic perspective offers a remarkably practical response to this pattern. It does not ask you to erase your memories or pretend painful experiences never happened. As Seneca wrote, "We suffer more often in imagination than in reality." The past contains valuable lessons, and wisdom grows from honest reflection. The problem begins when reflection quietly becomes residence. Learning from yesterday strengthens today's judgment. Living inside yesterday weakens today's presence. There is an enormous difference between remembering an experience and continuously reliving it. One creates understanding, the other creates unnecessary attachment. The mind often confuses these two processes because both involve thinking about the past, but their effects are completely different. Reflection eventually brings peace. Rumination rarely does. The same pattern appears in worries about the future. You rehearse difficult conversations that never happen. You prepare for failures that never arrive. You create entire emotional experiences based on possibilities rather than realities. Hours of mental energy disappear while nothing in the external world has actually changed. This habit feels responsible because planning has genuine value, but there is a point where preparation quietly becomes obsession. Once that line is crossed, thinking no longer serves action. Action begins serving endless thinking instead. You become trapped inside a cycle where your mind constantly promises that one more round of analysis will finally produce certainty. It never does. It simply asks for another round tomorrow. Letting go begins with recognizing that many of these mental habits continue only because they have never been questioned. The next time an old memory returns, notice whether it is offering a lesson or merely repeating familiar pain. The next time worry appears, ask whether it is leading toward meaningful action or simply encouraging another hour of speculation. These small moments of awareness interrupt patterns that may have been operating for years. You stop assuming that every thought deserves your complete attention simply because it appeared inside your mind. Instead, you begin choosing which thoughts deserve your energy and which ones deserve to pass quietly without becoming another emotional commitment. Over time, this quiet discipline changes the way you experience each new day. You stop arriving in the morning already carrying yesterday's arguments. You stop allowing old disappointments to introduce themselves before today's opportunities have the chance to unfold. The past remains part of your story, but it no longer writes your next chapter without permission. That is the true meaning of letting go. It is not forgetting what happened, denying what mattered, or pretending pain never existed. It is refusing to allow experiences that have already ended to continue directing the choices you make today. The lessons remain, the wisdom remains, the memories remain. What disappears is the unnecessary habit of carrying them as though they were still happening. In that quiet release, you discover that emotional freedom is often less about finding something new and more about finally putting down what was never yours to carry any longer. As those emotional burdens begin growing lighter, something unexpected happens to your attention. For the first time in a long while, your mind is no longer occupied with defending itself against yesterday or preparing endlessly for tomorrow. The present moment, which always seemed ordinary before, begins revealing details that were hidden beneath constant mental noise. A conversation receives your full attention instead of half your attention and half your anxiety. A quiet walk becomes something you actually experience, rather than simply move through while thinking about unfinished problems. Even ordinary routines begin feeling different because your awareness is no longer divided between memories that cannot be changed and futures that have not yet arrived. Nothing around you may have changed at all, yet the quality of your experience changes profoundly because your attention has finally returned to where your life has always been unfolding. This shift often feels surprisingly unfamiliar because so many people spend years living almost everywhere except the present. While eating a meal, they are already thinking about the next task. While working, they are replaying yesterday's mistake. While speaking with someone they care about, part of their attention is occupied by worries that have not happened yet. The body remains in one place while the mind continuously travels somewhere else. This constant movement becomes so normal that many no longer recognize it as movement. They simply assume that this is how thinking works. In reality, much of this mental activity has very little purpose beyond maintaining a sense of control over things that cannot be controlled. The present moment quietly waits in the background while attention chases places where life is not actually happening. One reason this habit becomes so persistent is because the mind often believes that presence is unproductive. Sitting quietly with what is happening now can feel almost uncomfortable at first. Without constant planning, worrying, analyzing, or remembering, there is a strange sense of emptiness. Many people rush to fill that space immediately because stillness feels unfamiliar. Yet underneath that discomfort lies something deeply valuable. The present moment asks nothing from you except awareness. It does not require you to solve next month's problems before they arrive. It does not ask you to rewrite conversations that ended days ago. It simply invites you to experience reality as it exists, instead of as your fears or memories continually describe it. That invitation is easy to overlook because it rarely announces itself with excitement. It arrives quietly, hidden inside ordinary moments that previously seemed too simple to deserve attention. The Stoics understood this in a remarkably practical way. They did not search for peace by trying to escape difficult circumstances or by hoping life would eventually become free from uncertainty. They recognized that life itself unfolds only within the present, while the mind constantly tries to relocate that experience somewhere else. Their discipline was not about withdrawing from responsibility or pretending the future did not matter. It was about refusing to abandon the only moment where responsible action is actually possible. Planning still has its place. Learning from experience remains essential, but both activities lose their value when they become substitutes for living. Reflection should help you return to the present with greater wisdom, not keep you permanently attached to another time. As your awareness becomes steadier, you begin noticing opportunities that were always available but previously hidden beneath distraction. Small acts of kindness become easier because your attention is no longer consumed by internal conflict. Genuine listening becomes possible because you are no longer preparing your response before the other person has finished speaking. Decisions become clearer because they are based upon what is actually happening instead of imagined scenarios that exist only inside your thoughts. Even simple pleasures regain their depth. The warmth of sunlight through a window, the sound of rain, the rhythm of your breathing, the quiet satisfaction of completing meaningful work without rushing toward the next achievement. These experiences have always been part of life. The difference is that your attention is finally available to receive them. This growing presence also changes the way difficulties are experienced. Earlier, one problem often expanded until it overshadowed everything else. A single disappointment colored the entire day because the mind repeatedly returned to it. Now the difficult moment remains exactly what it is, a moment. It still deserves attention, but it no longer consumes every other experience surrounding it. You begin noticing that joy and difficulty can exist side by side. A stressful week can still contain meaningful conversations. A painful season can still include moments of gratitude. Presence allows these realities to coexist because it stops forcing every experience into one emotional category. Life becomes more balanced, not because hardships disappear, but because they are no longer given permission to define the whole picture. An interesting change also takes place in your sense of time. Days no longer feel as though they are constantly slipping away unnoticed. When your attention remains rooted in the present, ordinary experiences become richer, and richer experiences naturally feel fuller. Time seems less rushed because your awareness is no longer skipping ahead before the current moment has even finished unfolding. This does not slow the clock itself. It changes your relationship with it. Instead of constantly waiting for a future where everything will finally feel complete, you begin recognizing that much of what you have been searching for has always been quietly available in the way you experience today. The present stops becoming something to endure on the way to a better future. It becomes the place where that better life is actually built. This perspective also softens the endless pressure to optimize every moment. Modern life often encourages the belief that every minute must produce measurable progress, visible achievement, or constant productivity. While meaningful work certainly matters, constantly evaluating your worth through output creates another form of restlessness. Presence introduces a healthier balance. You still pursue goals, honor responsibilities, and work toward meaningful improvements, but you no longer sacrifice today's peace for tomorrow's success. Ironically, this calmer approach often improves the quality of your work because your attention becomes more focused. You stop scattering your energy across endless worries and begin investing it fully in the task immediately before you. Gradually, presence becomes less like a technique and more like a way of living. It no longer requires constant reminders because it begins shaping the rhythm of your everyday experience. You notice your thoughts wandering and gently return them without frustration. You catch yourself replaying old disappointments and choose not to follow them any further. You recognize anxiety reaching toward an uncertain future and quietly bring your attention back to what can actually be done today. These repeated moments may appear small in isolation, yet together they create a profound transformation. The mind becomes less crowded, your relationships become more genuine, your work becomes more intentional, and your emotional life becomes less dependent on circumstances existing somewhere outside the present moment. Perhaps this is why lasting peace so rarely arrives through escape. Changing locations, achieving another goal, or waiting for perfect circumstances may offer temporary relief, but the restless mind often follows wherever you go. Real peace begins differently. It grows each time you return your attention to the life unfolding directly before you, instead of constantly searching for another version of reality somewhere else. The present has never asked you to be perfect. It has only asked you to be fully there. And the more completely you learn to meet that invitation, the more you discover that the quiet opportunities you spent years searching for were waiting patiently in moments you almost overlooked. Living this way quietly changes something that reaches far beyond emotional reactions. It changes the way you make decisions. Earlier, many choices felt urgent simply because your emotions made them feel urgent. A difficult message demanded an immediate reply. Criticism seemed to require an instant defense. Frustration insisted that something had to be done before the feeling became any stronger. Looking back, it becomes clear that urgency and importance are not always the same thing. The emotional mind often treats them as though they are inseparable, convincing you that because something feels intense, it must also deserve immediate action. Yet some of the decisions that shape a life are made quietly, while many of the loudest emotional impulses disappear completely if given enough time. Learning to recognize this difference changes not only your reactions, but the entire rhythm of your thinking. Emotions have an extraordinary ability to create the illusion of certainty, Anger tells you that you already understand the whole situation. Fear insists it knows exactly what the future will bring. Excitement promises that nothing could possibly go wrong. Discouragement whispers that there is no point trying again. In the moment, each emotion presents itself as though it were offering objective truth. That is why decisions made during emotional intensity often feel completely justified while they are happening. Only later, when the feeling has settled, does another perspective begin to appear. The words spoken in frustration suddenly seem unnecessary. The opportunity abandoned out of fear looks different. The promise made through excitement reveals consequences that were invisible only hours before. Time itself exposes the difference between emotional certainty and thoughtful judgment. This is one reason deliberate living requires patience before it requires intelligence. You do not always need more information. Sometimes you simply need enough distance for the emotional storm to settle before deciding what deserves your attention. The situation itself may remain unchanged, but your relationship with it changes dramatically once immediate emotion stops controlling the conversation inside your mind. You begin noticing details that urgency refused to let you see. Another person's perspective becomes easier to understand. Hidden consequences become more visible. Solutions that seemed impossible suddenly appear surprisingly reasonable. None of this happens because you became a different person overnight. It happens because clarity finally had enough room to emerge after emotion stopped speaking quite so loudly. This gradual shift influences even the smallest decisions throughout an ordinary day. Earlier, a passing irritation might have shaped the tone of every conversation that followed. One stressful meeting quietly influenced the way you spoke to your family later that evening. Fatigue became impatience, disappointment became withdrawal. Without realizing it, temporary emotions repeatedly made permanent contributions to your behavior. As awareness grows, those automatic connections begin weakening. You notice the feeling before it silently enters the next conversation. You recognize that frustration belongs to one situation instead of allowing it to spread across the entire day. Emotional experiences remain real, but they stop becoming architects of every choice you make afterward. There is also a deeper transformation taking place beneath these practical changes. Your decisions gradually stop revolving around comfort alone and begin revolving around values. Earlier, the easiest response often felt like the correct one because it relieved immediate discomfort. Avoiding a difficult conversation seemed safer than having it. Seeking approval felt easier than expressing honest disagreement. Remaining silent appeared more comfortable than risking misunderstanding. Over time, another question quietly replaces those habits. Instead of asking which choice feels easiest right now, you begin asking which choice reflects the person you genuinely want to become. That question changes everything because it shifts your attention away from temporary emotional relief and toward lasting character. The answer is not always comfortable, but it is often much clearer. Values possess a quiet stability that emotions rarely provide. Feelings naturally change throughout the day. They rise and fall depending on circumstances, energy, health, relationships, and countless other influences beyond your control. Principles remain remarkably steady by comparison. Honesty remains valuable, whether speaking it feels easy or difficult. Patience remains meaningful, regardless of how impatient someone else becomes. Integrity does not suddenly lose importance because life becomes inconvenient. Building your decisions upon these steadier foundations gradually creates an inner consistency that emotions alone cannot provide. You stop reinventing yourself every time your mood changes because your direction is no longer determined by passing emotional weather. People around you often begin noticing this consistency before you fully appreciate it yourself. Conversations become calmer because you are less likely to react impulsively. Others learn that your words carry greater weight because they are no longer driven by whichever emotion happened to arrive first. Trust quietly grows. Not because you become perfect, but because your behavior becomes more predictable in the healthiest possible way. You respond instead of exploding. You pause instead of assuming. You think before speaking. These habits communicate something powerful without requiring explanation. They tell others that your actions are guided by something deeper than temporary feelings. Perhaps the greatest reward, however, has very little to do with how other people see you. It appears in the quiet relationship you develop with yourself. Earlier, you may have admired moments when you won arguments, impressed others, or successfully defended your reputation. Those victories often felt satisfying, yet many disappeared almost as quickly as they arrived. A different kind of satisfaction begins replacing them. It comes from knowing that you remained true to your own principles, even when circumstances tempted you elsewhere. You leave a difficult conversation feeling at peace, not because you controlled the outcome, but because you controlled your conduct. You experience disappointment without abandoning your integrity. You face uncertainty without abandoning your judgment. These moments rarely receive applause from the outside, yet they quietly strengthen something far more valuable within. This growing self-respect cannot be borrowed from another person because it is built through repeated evidence collected over time. Every thoughtful decision becomes another reminder that you can trust yourself. Every moment of restraint strengthens confidence in your own judgment. Every choice guided by principle instead of impulse quietly reshapes your identity. Unlike praise, this confidence does not disappear when opinions change. Unlike success, it remains available even after setbacks. It grows because you repeatedly witness yourself acting according to values you genuinely believe in, rather than emotions that happen to pass through you on a particular day. Eventually, this deliberate way of living becomes less like a strategy and more like your natural character. The pause before responding no longer feels forced. Reflection becomes as familiar as reaction once was. Emotional intensity still appears because it is part of being human, but it no longer carries the same authority over your decisions. You understand that the strongest choices are rarely the fastest ones. They emerge from a quieter place, one that values clarity over urgency and purpose over impulse. From that place, your life gradually becomes more consistent, your relationships become more genuine, and your peace becomes less dependent on circumstances that change from one day to the next. Long before anyone else recognizes the difference, you begin recognizing it yourself. And there are few experiences more meaningful than discovering that the person you are becoming is finally someone you deeply respect. That growing sense of self-respect eventually becomes one of the strongest forms of stability you can develop, because it is no longer borrowed from the changing opinions of other people. Earlier, your emotional balance may have depended on receiving reassurance that you were doing well, making the right choices, or living up to expectations. Encouraging words created confidence, while criticism quietly unsettled everything you believed about yourself. It felt as though your identity had to be constantly confirmed from the outside before you could fully trust it on the inside. The difficulty with living this way is that external validation is naturally inconsistent. People's opinions change, their moods shift, their attention moves elsewhere. If your peace depends upon remaining permanently approved by everyone around you, then your peace becomes just as unstable as the opinions you are trying so hard to protect. Once your confidence begins growing from your own conduct, instead of constant reassurance, something remarkable happens. Your emotional foundation becomes much harder for circumstances to shake, because it is no longer standing on constantly moving ground. This change does not happen because praise suddenly loses all meaning. Kind words still feel encouraging. Recognition remains enjoyable. Appreciation continues strengthening healthy relationships. The difference is that these experiences stop becoming emotional necessities. Earlier, praise may have felt like proof that you were valuable. Without it, self-doubt quietly returned. Now appreciation becomes something you welcome without depending upon it for your sense of worth. You enjoy encouragement because it reflects kindness rather than because it temporarily repairs your confidence. This subtle distinction creates enormous freedom. Gratitude replaces dependence. You become capable of receiving compliments without desperately chasing more of them, and capable of working quietly even when no one immediately notices your effort. The same transformation quietly changes your relationship with criticism. Earlier, criticism often felt deeply personal because your identity had become tightly connected to how others perceived you. As Epictetus advised, if anyone tells you that a certain person speaks ill of you, do not make excuses about what is said of you, but answer, "He was ignorant of my other faults, else he would not have mentioned these alone." A single negative comment could overshadow countless positive experiences simply because your mind interpreted it as evidence that something fundamental was wrong. As your inner foundation grows stronger, criticism begins serving a different purpose. Instead of immediately accepting it or rejecting it, you examine it carefully. If it contains truth, you appreciate the opportunity to grow. If it is unfair or incomplete, you allow it to remain another person's perspective instead of making it your own internal voice. This balanced response protects both humility and confidence at the same time. You remain open to learning without becoming emotionally dependent on every opinion offered by the world around you. This approach also changes how you experience success itself. Achievement remains meaningful because creating, improving, and reaching worthwhile goals are valuable parts of life. Yet, success slowly stops becoming the place where you search for your identity. Earlier, accomplishing something important may have briefly convinced you that you finally mattered, only for that feeling to disappear as soon as another challenge appeared. There was always another achievement waiting to replace the previous one, because satisfaction built entirely upon accomplishment rarely lasts very long. Eventually, the mind begins believing that self-worth exists somewhere beyond the next goal, instead of recognizing that character is being formed during the journey itself. As this perspective changes, success becomes something you celebrate, rather than something you desperately need in order to feel complete. Failure changes alongside it. Setbacks still disappoint you because meaningful goals naturally matter. The difference is that they no longer define the story you tell yourself about who you are. One unsuccessful attempt does not suddenly erase years of growth. One mistake no longer convinces you that your entire future has been damaged beyond repair. You begin separating outcomes from identity in the same way you learn to separate emotions from actions. A failed project becomes information instead of condemnation. A wrong decision becomes experience instead of permanent proof of inadequacy. This perspective allows resilience to grow because you stop carrying every disappointment as though it were a verdict on your value as a person. An interesting shift also appears in your relationships. When emotional dependence begins fading, your interactions with others become noticeably lighter. Earlier, you may have entered conversations hoping to receive reassurance without even realizing it. Approval, agreement, or recognition quietly became emotional needs disguised as ordinary conversations. As those needs become less demanding, your attention naturally returns to the people themselves instead of constantly monitoring what they think about you. Listening becomes easier because your mind is no longer busy protecting your image. Genuine curiosity replaces quiet self-consciousness. Relationships become less transactional because they are no longer measured by how much validation they provide. Instead, they become opportunities to understand, support, and connect without constantly asking for confirmation of your own worth. This emotional independence should never be confused with emotional isolation. Becoming less dependent on external validation does not mean becoming indifferent to other people or pretending their opinions no longer matter. Healthy relationships still require empathy, honesty, accountability, and openness to feedback. Emotional independence simply changes where your stability comes from. You remain connected without becoming controlled. You care without becoming consumed. You appreciate encouragement while recognizing that your peace cannot rely entirely upon receiving it. This balance allows you to participate fully in relationships without quietly surrendering your emotional well-being every time someone else's mood changes. As this way of living becomes more familiar, a quieter form of confidence continues developing beneath the surface. It is not loud because it does not need to prove itself. It does not seek constant attention because it is no longer trying to convince anyone, including yourself, that you deserve respect. It simply grows through repeated evidence collected over countless ordinary days. You keep your word when it would have been easier not to. You remain patient when frustration invites a quicker reaction. You choose honesty when convenience offers a simpler alternative. These moments rarely receive applause, yet together they create something much stronger than public admiration. They create private certainty. You begin trusting yourself because your actions consistently reflect the values you claim to believe in. This trust becomes one of the most valuable forms of freedom a person can experience. You no longer spend endless energy wondering whether everyone approves of your choices before making them. You stop changing important parts of yourself simply to avoid temporary criticism. You become more willing to accept misunderstanding when remaining true to your principles requires it. That willingness is not stubbornness. It is the quiet confidence that comes from knowing your identity has roots deeper than public opinion. External circumstances continue changing just as they always have. Some days bring encouragement, while others bring disappointment. Some people appreciate your efforts, while others never will. Through all of it, your emotional balance remains increasingly steady because it is anchored somewhere those changing circumstances cannot easily reach. Over time, this deeper stability begins influencing every part of your life. You approach opportunities with greater courage because failure no longer threatens your identity. You recover from setbacks more quickly because your confidence survives the outcome. You experience praise without becoming dependent on it, and criticism without becoming defined by it. Success becomes meaningful, failure becomes instructive, relationships become healthier, and solitude becomes more peaceful because none of these experiences are carrying the impossible responsibility of determining your worth. Emotional dependence quietly gives way to emotional freedom, and that freedom is not dramatic or loud. It reveals itself in the calm consistency with which you continue living according to your values, regardless of how unpredictable the world chooses to become. The less energy you spend trying to control other people, the more naturally your presence begins influencing them. At first, this seems almost contradictory. Many assume influence comes from stronger arguments, louder opinions, sharper words, or the ability to convince everyone else that they are right. Yet life quietly demonstrates something different. Think about the people whose presence leaves a lasting impression. They are rarely the ones reacting to every disagreement or defending themselves against every criticism. More often, they are the ones who remain composed when others become overwhelmed. Their steadiness changes the atmosphere around them without demanding attention. They do not force calmness into a conversation. They bring it with them. This quiet stability often reaches people more deeply than persuasion ever could, because emotional composure has a way of communicating confidence long before a single word is spoken. Human beings naturally respond to emotional signals, whether they realize it or not. Walk into a room where someone is visibly anxious, and the tension often spreads before anyone understands why. Enter another room where someone remains calm during a difficult situation, and that steadiness quietly affects everyone present. Psychologists sometimes describe this as emotional contagion, the tendency for emotions to pass from one person to another through subtle expressions. body language, tone of voice, and behavior. Whether people know the term or not, they experience it every day. Emotions move through groups remarkably quickly. Fear creates more fear. Anger encourages more anger. Impatience invites impatience. The same principle works in the opposite direction as well. Calmness has a quiet influence because it interrupts emotional escalation before it gains momentum. One steady person often changes the direction of an entire conversation simply by refusing to mirror the emotional intensity surrounding them. Earlier, you may have believed that staying calm meant giving up influence. If you did not immediately defend yourself, perhaps people would think you were weak. If you chose silence during an argument, maybe others would assume you had nothing worthwhile to say. These fears are understandable because the modern world often rewards immediate reactions. Quick responses appear confident, loud opinions receive attention. Emotional intensity is frequently mistaken for strength simply because it is more visible. Yet visibility and influence are not the same thing. Many people command attention for a few moments while quietly losing respect over time. Others speak very little, but when they do, people naturally listen because their words emerge from careful judgment instead of temporary emotion. Lasting influence grows from consistency rather than intensity. This consistency becomes especially noticeable during difficult moments. Almost anyone can appear composed when circumstances are comfortable. Real character reveals itself when plans fall apart. Criticism appears unexpectedly, or pressure begins rising. During these moments, emotional habits become visible to everyone around you. A person who immediately blames others communicates insecurity even while trying to appear confident. Someone who reacts impulsively reveals that their emotions are leading the conversation instead of their judgment. On the other hand, a person who pauses before speaking, listens carefully, and responds thoughtfully creates an entirely different impression. They demonstrate that difficult circumstances are not determining the quality of their behavior. This quiet discipline often earns trust without ever asking for it, because people instinctively recognize reliability when they encounter it. Trust grows through repeated experiences rather than dramatic gestures. Every time someone watches you remain patient during disagreement, they quietly collect evidence about your character. Every moment you refuse unnecessary conflict strengthens the belief that your responses can be relied upon. This process usually happens beneath conscious awareness. People may struggle to explain exactly why they trust one individual more than another, yet the pattern remains remarkably consistent. Reliability creates emotional safety. Emotional safety encourages openness. Openness strengthens relationships. None of this requires impressive speeches or carefully crafted persuasion. It develops through countless ordinary moments where your behavior remains aligned with your values, even when emotions invite another direction. An interesting shift also takes place inside you during this process. Earlier, influence may have been something you actively pursued. You wanted people to understand your perspective, appreciate your efforts, or agree with your conclusions. Those desires often created subtle pressure because your emotional satisfaction depended partly upon changing someone else's mind. As emotional independence grows stronger, that pressure gradually disappears. You continue expressing your thoughts honestly, but you no longer feel responsible for controlling another person's response. Ironically, this relaxed approach often makes your words more persuasive. People naturally become more receptive when they do not feel manipulated, judged, or emotionally cornered. They sense that you are sharing an idea rather than forcing a conclusion. Respect replaces resistance because your calmness leaves room for them to think instead of react. This does not mean everyone will suddenly agree with you. Disagreement remains part of every meaningful relationship. Different experiences naturally produce different perspectives, and emotional maturity accepts this reality without seeing it as a threat. The difference is that disagreement no longer immediately becomes conflict. You become comfortable allowing another person to hold a different opinion without experiencing an urgent need to defeat it. That confidence quietly changes the emotional atmosphere because conversations stop becoming competitions. They become opportunities to understand, clarify, and occasionally learn something new. Others often respond by lowering their own emotional defenses because your steadiness gives them permission to do the same. The Stoics recognized that real influence begins with governing yourself before attempting to influence anyone else. Trying to lead another person's emotions while your own reactions remain uncontrolled creates a contradiction that people sense immediately. Words encouraging patience lose their power when spoken impatiently. Advice about discipline becomes difficult to trust when delivered through impulsive behavior. Genuine authority emerges when actions consistently support the principles being expressed. This is why calmness often carries more weight than eloquence. It demonstrates rather than merely describes. People are far more likely to remember how you handled difficulty than the exact words you used while explaining your philosophy. Another quiet benefit appears as this way of living becomes more natural. You stop measuring every interaction by whether you successfully changed another person's opinion. Sometimes the most meaningful outcome is simply remaining true to your own character, regardless of the conversation's result. This perspective removes enormous emotional pressure because your success is no longer determined entirely by external responses. You speak honestly, listen carefully, remain respectful, and accept that what happens afterward belongs partly to someone else. That acceptance allows you to leave conversations with greater peace because your sense of accomplishment depends upon your conduct rather than complete agreement. This is how lasting character is usually formed. People often imagine transformation happening through dramatic breakthroughs, unforgettable conversations, or extraordinary moments of insight. While those experiences can certainly leave a lasting impression, they rarely change a life on their own. Lasting change grows differently. It develops through small decisions repeated so often that they eventually become familiar. You choose patience during one conversation. You choose honesty during another. You decide not to react impulsively after receiving disappointing news. None of these moments seem remarkable in isolation. They often pass without recognition from anyone else. Yet together, they begin reshaping the way your mind naturally operates. What once required constant effort gradually becomes your normal response because repetition quietly teaches the nervous system that another way of living is possible. The brain adapts remarkably well to whatever patterns it experiences repeatedly. This is true whether those patterns strengthen anxiety or patience, impulsiveness or reflection. Earlier, reacting immediately may have felt natural simply because it had been practiced countless times. The emotional pathways became familiar through repetition rather than intention. Every time frustration led directly to action, that connection quietly became stronger. Every time worry produced endless overthinking, the habit became easier to repeat the next time uncertainty appeared. Fortunately, the same principle works in the opposite direction. Every thoughtful pause strengthens another pathway. Every calm response becomes another reminder that emotions can be experienced without automatically controlling behavior. Gradually, what once felt difficult begins requiring less conscious effort because your mind has become familiar with a healthier pattern. This is why emotional discipline cannot be measured only by extraordinary situations. As Aristotle observed, we are what we repeatedly do. Excellence, then, is not an act, but a habit. Anyone can remain calm occasionally. The greater question is how consistently those qualities appear throughout ordinary life. The way you respond when someone interrupts you, the patience you show while waiting in a long line, the attention you give during conversations that offer no obvious reward, the honesty you practice when no one would notice a small compromise. These seemingly insignificant moments quietly reveal far more about character than dramatic situations that occur only once in a while. They also provide the greatest opportunities for growth because they appear every single day. Character is not built through rare heroic decisions alone. It is built through ordinary choices, repeated until they become part of who you naturally are. As this consistency develops, another change begins taking place beneath the surface. Earlier, emotional discipline may have required constant internal reminders. You needed to stop yourself before reacting, consciously slow your breathing, or deliberately choose another response. Eventually, these pauses begin happening almost automatically. It is not because emotions have disappeared. They remain just as human as before. The difference is that your first impulse is no longer your only impulse. A space naturally appears between feeling and action, and within that space your judgment quietly takes its place. You notice the emotion, but you no longer mistake it for a command. The pause itself has become familiar, almost effortless, because it has been practiced so many times that it now belongs to your natural way of thinking. This quiet transformation often surprises people because it feels less dramatic than expected. Many assume emotional growth should create an entirely different personality. They expect to become completely unaffected by criticism, immune to disappointment, or permanently calm regardless of circumstances. Real maturity looks much simpler. You still experience frustration, uncertainty, excitement, and fear. The difference lies in what happens next. Those emotions no longer immediately determine your words or decisions. They become experiences you acknowledge instead of identities you adopt. You stop saying, "This feeling is who I am right now," and begin recognizing, "This feeling is passing through me." That subtle distinction changes everything because it allows emotions to exist without giving them permanent authority over your behavior. People around you often begin noticing these changes before you fully appreciate them yourself. Conversations become easier because you are no longer reacting defensively to every misunderstanding. Others feel heard because you have learned to listen without preparing your reply before they finish speaking. Difficult situations become more manageable because your presence introduces calm instead of additional tension. Friends, family, and colleagues may struggle to explain exactly what has changed, yet they sense a greater steadiness in the way you carry yourself. Your words become more thoughtful because they are no longer competing with emotional urgency. Even silence begins feeling more comfortable because you no longer believe every pause requires immediate explanation. There is also a deeper form of freedom that emerges from this way of living. Earlier, much of your energy may have been spent managing emotional consequences after they had already happened. You apologized for impulsive words. You regretted decisions made during frustration. You replayed conversations wishing you had responded differently. As thoughtful habits become more natural, these cycles begin appearing less often. Not because life has become easier, but because your responses have become wiser before regret has the chance to appear. Emotional discipline quietly shifts from repairing unnecessary damage to preventing much of it altogether. That prevention often goes unnoticed because nothing dramatic happens, yet its influence touches every part of your life. Eventually, the distinction between practicing emotional discipline and simply living begins disappearing. Patience becomes part of how you listen. Honesty becomes part of how you speak. Presence becomes part of how you experience ordinary moments. Reflection becomes part of how you make decisions. These qualities stop feeling like techniques borrowed from philosophy and begin feeling like natural expressions of your own character. You no longer remember to be patient because patience has become familiar. You no longer struggle to remain composed because composure has been strengthened through countless ordinary experiences. The habits that once required deliberate effort quietly become your default way of moving through the world. Perhaps this is the deepest lesson hidden beneath all the others. Character is never created in one extraordinary afternoon. It is built slowly, almost invisibly, through thousands of moments that appear too ordinary to matter. Each thoughtful response adds another small piece. Each restrained impulse strengthens another quiet habit. Each decision to act according to your values instead of temporary emotions shapes the person you are becoming. Looking back years later, the transformation often seems sudden, but it never truly was. It was the result of ordinary choices made consistently enough that they eventually became inseparable from your nature. And once that happens, emotional discipline is no longer something you practice. It becomes the quiet foundation upon which the rest of your life naturally stands. Perhaps this is the lesson everything else has quietly been leading toward from the very beginning. Emotional discipline has never been about becoming cold, distant, or untouched by life. It is not about pretending disappointment no longer hurts or convincing yourself that anger, fear, or sadness should never appear. Those emotions belong to being human, and denying them only creates another conflict inside the mind. The real practice has always been something much quieter. It is learning that an emotion can arrive without immediately becoming your identity. It is realizing that a feeling deserves acknowledgement, but not automatic obedience. For years, many people unknowingly allow temporary emotions to make permanent decisions. A few minutes of anger damages a relationship that took years to build. One moment of fear prevents an opportunity that could have changed an entire future. A brief feeling of insecurity becomes the reason someone never shares an important idea or pursues a meaningful goal. Looking back, these moments rarely stand out while they are happening. They seem ordinary at the time. Only later does it become clear that what shaped the future was not the circumstance itself, but the decision made while emotion temporarily occupied the driver's seat. This is why the smallest pause often carries the greatest power. From the outside, it may appear as though nothing is happening at all. A conversation continues. Someone speaks carelessly. An unexpected problem appears. Another opinion challenges your own. Yet internally, something entirely different is unfolding. As Socrates wisely said, the unexamined life is not worth living. Instead of reacting automatically, you remain present long enough to allow judgment to enter before action follows. That pause is invisible to almost everyone else, but it changes everything. It creates the space where wisdom has the opportunity to speak before impulse takes control. Many people spend years searching for dramatic techniques that promise immediate transformation, overlooking the fact that countless lives are quietly shaped by moments lasting only a few seconds. The quality of those seconds often determines the quality of everything that follows. One thoughtful response can prevent days of regret. One patient decision can preserve years of trust. One calm breath can stop an emotional chain reaction before it ever begins. It is also worth remembering that this discipline is not something reserved for extraordinary situations. Life is rarely transformed by a single dramatic event. More often, it is shaped by ordinary moments, repeated so consistently that they become part of your character. You choose not to interrupt someone while they are speaking because understanding matters more than proving a point. You resist the urge to respond immediately because clarity matters more than speed. You admit a mistake without allowing pride to defend it because honesty matters more than protecting an image. None of these choices attract much attention. They may never become stories worth telling, yet together they quietly build the person you are becoming. Character is formed in exactly these kinds of moments because they appear every single day, offering another opportunity to strengthen habits that eventually become second nature. This steady practice also changes the way you remember your own life. Earlier, difficult experiences may have been defined entirely by the emotions surrounding them. Looking back at painful memories, you saw only disappointment, frustration, or loss. As your perspective matures, another layer gradually becomes visible. You begin noticing who you became because of those experiences, rather than only what happened during them. Challenges stop serving merely as reminders of suffering. They become reminders of patience that was developed, understanding that was gained, or resilience that quietly emerged while you were simply trying to move forward. The past no longer appears as a collection of emotional victories and defeats. It becomes evidence that your character has been shaped through experiences that once seemed unbearable, but eventually revealed strengths you did not know you possessed. Another subtle transformation takes place in the stories you tell yourself about the future. Earlier, uncertainty often looked like something waiting to threaten your peace. Every unknown outcome demanded preparation, prediction, or endless analysis. Now the future begins looking different because you trust something that did not exist before. You trust your ability to meet whatever arrives with greater wisdom than you once possessed. That confidence is not based on believing life will become easier. It comes from knowing that your response no longer depends entirely upon your first emotion. Whether tomorrow brings success or disappointment, certainty or confusion, praise or criticism, you know there is now a quieter place within you capable of responding thoughtfully rather than automatically. That trust removes an enormous burden because you stop believing you must control the future in order to face it well. People around you may notice this transformation in unexpected ways. They may describe you as calmer, more patient, or more grounded without fully understanding why. They may feel more comfortable speaking honestly because they know they will not immediately be met with defensiveness or emotional volatility. Others may begin seeking your perspective during difficult moments because your steadiness creates space where clear thinking becomes possible. These changes are meaningful, but they remain secondary. The greatest transformation is the one taking place inside you. It is the quiet confidence of knowing that your peace no longer disappears every time circumstances become uncomfortable. It is the growing certainty that your values remain available even when your emotions fluctuate. It is the freedom that comes from realizing you no longer have to become every feeling that passes through your mind. None of this means the journey ever truly ends. There will still be days when impatience returns unexpectedly, moments when fear speaks louder than reason, conversations where old habits briefly reappear before awareness catches them. Emotional growth has never been about achieving permanent perfection because perfection belongs to imagination rather than reality. It has always been about shortening the distance between reaction and awareness. Earlier, that distance may have lasted hours, days, or even weeks. Gradually, it becomes minutes, then moments. Eventually, awareness begins arriving almost alongside the emotion itself. That is genuine progress. Not the absence of difficult feelings, but the growing ability to recognize them before they quietly take control of your actions. Perhaps that is why wisdom often appears so ordinary from the outside. It rarely announces itself with dramatic gestures or unforgettable speeches. It reveals itself through restraint when reaction would have been easier, through listening when interruption felt tempting, through patience when urgency demanded immediate action, through kindness when frustration invited something else entirely. These quiet choices rarely attract applause because they often go unnoticed by everyone except the person making them. Yet they become the invisible architecture of a meaningful life. Every thoughtful response adds another stone. Every deliberate decision strengthens another foundation. Every moment of self-restraint quietly shapes the person who will meet tomorrow's challenges with greater clarity than yesterday's. In the end, the greatest victory was never about controlling the world around you. It was never about winning every argument, avoiding every disappointment, or eliminating every uncomfortable emotion from your life. Those goals have always been beyond your reach. The real victory has always been much closer than that. It has been the gradual discovery that your life does not have to be directed by whatever feeling happens to appear first. You possess the ability to pause, to observe, to understand, and then to choose. Within that quiet ability lies a freedom that no circumstance can permanently take away. The world will continue changing, People will continue surprising you, and uncertainty will always remain part of the human experience. But if you continue protecting that small space between feeling and action, you will discover that the strongest part of your life was never built during moments of comfort. It was built one quiet decision at a time, every time wisdom was allowed to speak before impulse had the final word. As you move forward, remember this: peace is not something you find when life finally becomes easy. It is something you build each time you choose wisdom over impulse, patience over haste, and clarity over emotion. Those quiet choices may seem small today, but over time they shape the person you become. If this reflection resonated with you, continue the journey by watching one of the videos on your screen now. Each one explores another timeless Stoic lesson that can help you strengthen your mind and live with greater calm, purpose, and resilience. Thank you for being a part of Stoic Journal. Until next time, take care of your mind, and it will take care of your life.